Nice to see you all. I was thinking, my, what a quiet group you are today, and then I saw that actually everybody's muted, so you don't have much choice in that, right? Is the air quality abysmal there again? I heard that it was going to be a bad weekend.
Mhm.
You'd have to hold.
It's okay today and tomorrow, I think. Then it's getting worse. That's what the
Okay.
Yeah, it's supposed to get quite hot Sunday and Monday.
Yesterday we had a clear day, fresh air.
Nice, good, yeah, and I've been seeing that they're quite concerned about the conditions for fire over the next few days, which of course is exactly what we need right now. Shall I get us started? I'm seeing we're up to upwards of 40 people, so it looks like we're coming up to speed. I'm trying to find Elizabeth. There she is. Are we ready to go?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm already recording and you're co-host, so we should begin.
All right, good. Then I'm going to go ahead and get us started. And I am going to do something today that I'm afraid I may do a fair bit of over the next month. Obviously, we are a month away from a national election. And although I do want to continue with my lecture series on race and justice in America, and I do actually think that in many respects, this is extremely important to understanding what's happening in American politics, not only the kind of horse race dimension to it, who has a good chance of winning or how are people being mobilized, but also in terms of the prospects for American politics. We are becoming a multiracial society that's happening quickly, and it seems irreversible. And whether or not America remains a just and democratic society will depend fundamentally on how we reckon with our past of racial injustice in order to potentially build a more diverse, inclusive, fair, just, respectful society for the 21st century. And so, having said all of that, while I am gonna, I hope, have a little bit of time to transition today from the historical overview I've been providing you for the last couple of weeks to a more specific discussion of the role of law in creating the contemporary racial order in the United States. Before I do that, I do want to talk about what's happening politically. And I'm going to talk about two things, maybe three things in tandem. One of them is just to give you an update on the horse race. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I am going to focus more on the Senate today. And the reason I'm going to focus more on the Senate is because it seems to me that it's extremely relevant to two things that are obviously on all of our minds. One of them is what's going to happen to the Supreme Court. And the other is, given the recent discussion of a peaceful transition in power and what seems to be the sustained campaign on the part of the Trump political operation to undermine confidence in an election
it's no good.
that
It's no
Trump
good.
is increasingly worried that he's going to lose, right? Given all of that, what do we think is causing the difficulties in American democracy that are reflected in what's happening with the Supreme Court, or the question around whether there will be a peaceful transition in power, if there is in fact a transition in power. So the first thing I want you to notice, and again, for those of us who are looking at this across weeks, you may notice that this diagram has not changed remarkably in several weeks, right? I mean, sometimes it's 75 to 25, sometimes it's 77 to 22 with a tie, but it stays in this very similar range. And please remember that this is a model, right? This is not polls per se, although it's strongly based on polls, and the polls it's based on are the state level polls. And I want to say a little bit more about the stability and the basis for the stability of Biden's lead over Trump, and at the same time of Trump remaining within striking distance of Biden. And so the way in which presidential races are decided in the United States, of course, is at the state level. And while this diagram is a little difficult to read, I think if you spend a moment with it, you can unpack it. And what you would see, right, is that this is looking state by state from the bluest states, right? And you can see California down here, and Hawaii and DC and Massachusetts are the only states in the union where it seems even more probable that the Democrats are going to win. Having said all that, we've got the reddest states up here, but where the action is in the middle, right? And what you can see, and again, if you've been tracking this across weeks, I hope you may notice that Florida, North Carolina, and Ohio have shifted. And they've shifted from being states in which there was a marginal lead for Donald Trump to the most recent average of the state level polls showing a marginal lead for Joe Biden. Now, that's obviously good news for Joe Biden, but please remember that it hasn't changed his likelihood of winning the election. And I want to explain why that is for a moment, and to point out to you that what seems most likely in 2020 is that the presidential election will be decided in one of a few states, most likely Arizona, Pennsylvania, or Wisconsin. And what that means is that if Joe Biden has won Ohio, North Carolina, Florida, it's all but certain he'll also have won Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Because when we look at the composition of the electorate in those states, it's hard to envision a scenario in which Biden is winning in Ohio and not also winning in Pennsylvania, in which Biden is winning in Florida and not also winning in Arizona, right? Pennsylvania and Florida may be dissimilar from each other, but Ohio and Pennsylvania have a lot in common. Arizona and Florida have a lot in common. And the fact of the matter is that over the last month or so, there's not been much movement in the polls in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Arizona. And so though Biden's doing a little bit better in Ohio, Florida, and North Carolina, the people who build these models believe that that's not where the action is, and that he's not doing really much better in Arizona, Pennsylvania, or Wisconsin. And so this is where the race is right now. This does look good for Joe Biden, but I want you to next look at a couple other factors, right? So this is the way in which this model has moved over time. And as you can see, it's been very stable, really for a very long time, but especially since early September, when Biden chances increased, Trump's decreased, following the Republican National Convention. It appears that Trump got a little bit of a bump out of the convention, but it very quickly reverted close to the norm, or even got a little bit worse for Trump. Now, I want you to compare that with the national popular vote estimates based on polls. And as you can see, it looks like Joe Biden will win a decisive margin, by a decisive margin, if the vote is held today, if it were held today, right? And that this seems very unlikely to be eroded between now and election day. When I say eroded, to be fundamentally altered, to have Trump overtake Biden in the popular vote would take a spectacular meltdown in the Biden campaign or a spectacular turnaround in the Trump campaign. That's not impossible, but it's improbable. And so what you can see is that it seems very likely that Joe Biden will win a decisive victory in the popular vote, more decisive than Hillary Clinton won in 2016, but more decisive than Barack Obama won in 2008, perhaps doubling Obama's margin, right, from the last time a Democrat won the presidency. And so what I want you then to see, and this is, all of this data comes from the website 538. The chief statistician and organizer of that website is a man named Nate Silver. And Nate Silver put this diagram together about a month ago, which indicates if Biden wins the popular vote by 0 to 1 points, right, he has just a 6% chance of winning the Electoral College vote. If he wins it by approaching 2 points, his chance of winning goes up to 20%. If he wins it between 2 and 3 percentage points, that's where Clinton was, right? He'll have a essentially 50-50 chance of winning the presidency, not quite 50-50, right? If he wins by 3 or 4 points, it goes up to 75% essentially. And then once he gets up in the 4 to 5, 5 to 6, 6 to 7 percentage margin of victory, his chance goes up much greater. Now, that may appear peculiar to you, right? We live in a democracy. Why is it that the person who wins the popular vote doesn't just win the presidency? And we know the reason, right, of course, is because of the Electoral College. And here I just want to point out to you, to break this down a little bit, right? We've got 40 million people living in California. Most of them vote, and or I should say are eligible to vote. And it's quite likely that Biden will win 3 million more votes in California. But because California is winner take all, it makes no difference whether Biden wins 100,000 more votes or 1 million or 2 or 3 million more votes. He gets the same number of Electoral College votes, right? And because we have a number of large, that's to say very populous states that are very liberal, right? Massachusetts, California, New York, Illinois, they have a lot of Electoral College votes, but they have a lot of population, right? And so winning by a decisive margin in these votes does not translate into as many Electoral College votes as the outcome of the popular vote suggests, right? And so what really matters for the outcome of the Electoral College vote is what happens in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, perhaps Florida, right? And so what we're seeing then is a skew in American politics away from majority rule. And this is the design, in a sense, of the Constitution, to magnify the power of the less populous states, to prevent them from being overridden by the more popular states. It's, of course, reflected most importantly in the Senate. And so what I want to talk about next is the Senate for a few minutes, and I'll start with the horse race aspect. Let me just point out to you very quickly that the model that I just looked at assumes that polls are relatively accurate. And so one way to think about where the election is right now, if Biden wins every state where he's currently leading by 3 or more points, right? So that gets us out of the territory of the margin of error. He would win the Electoral College right now. if he won in every state where he's ahead, he would win something close to an electoral college landslide, right? And by the way, winning by 7 percentage points in the popular vote is something very close to a landslide as well. If the polls are off, if they're skewed, and please note that the polls were off in 2016, it's entirely possible that Trump could win, given where the polling is right now, if the vote were taken today. Now, I want to be clear, I don't think the polls are as far off as they were in 2016. Pollsters have been very careful to try to correct the mistakes they made in 2016. Having said that, we won't know until the votes are actually tallied whether or not the polls have a bias, and if so, how strong that bias is. And so I just want to issue that quick, caution about putting too much confidence in models that predict electoral outcomes. Now, having said that, I'm going to go back to looking at models that predict electoral outcomes and point out to you that based on how things are looking at the state level for the states that have Senate contests right now, and remember, right, only a third of the Senate is elected at a time. It's slightly more this election cycle because there are a couple special elections. It appears that the Democrats are slightly favored to regain the control of the Senate. And whether that means that they get 50% of the seats, that seems quite likely. And then, of course, actual control will depend on who controls the presidency, because the vice president breaks ties in the Senate. Or 51 seats, 52 seats, 53 seats, 54 seats, right? That's the range that, based on the current polls, it appears the Democrats are likely to be in. But please note that these races are very close, and it's still more than a month from Election Day. It's entirely possible things may change in Senate races in either direction. Please note, by the way, that if the Democrats win 53, 54 seats, this will be a blue wave election. That is to say, it'll be an election in which the Democrats have won in Arizona and North Carolina and Maine, places where typically it's difficult for the Democrats to win. They'll have won in Colorado also. And so that's one look at what's happening with this election. I now want to transition into the fact that obviously we are about to embark on an entirely unexpected chapter in this campaign that is going to center on replacing one of the most liberal members of the Supreme Court, the long-serving Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We spoke last week about her death, about her judicial legacy, about her importance in particular for women's rights and extending 14th Amendment protections to issues of sex-based discrimination. I just want to point out to you, and so one of the questions I think that's going to be important is whether or not, obviously I'm putting it in a way that frames it in the way that I view it, will Republican Senate candidates be punished for a hypocritical power play? When I say hypocritical, many of them are on the record as having said, as recently as 2016, the last time there was a presidential race, that they did not believe it was legitimate, democratic, to replace a Supreme Court nominee in the middle of a presidential election. They said that because it was Barack Obama who was going to replace a conservative justice with a more liberal justice. Ezra Klein in Vox says that was just mouth noise, We shouldn't take that at all seriously. But the fact of the matter is that I don't think voters are quite that cynical about politics yet, right? Which is to say, we do take seriously that when people say, use my words against me, this is my principle, and then within a few years, completely flip on that principle, they may be punished, right? And so one of the things you can see is that there's a clear and decisive outcome in all polls. And please note that these polls are very recently conducted, and things may change as the nomination process gets going. But there is a very clear consensus among the American people, right? Again, a 13-point advantage for the idea that the Supreme Court seat should be filled by the winner of the 2020 election, not by Trump now. And so the question is, given that the majority of the American people believe that, it's a fairly large majority, obviously there are some people who are undecided about this, but assuming that they don't all go in the direction of Trump should fill it, will in particular those Republicans who are currently running for the Senate perhaps be punished for their conduct in this case. And I will point out to you, it's really too early to see this, but there has been movement in favor of the Democrats in terms of how their prospects for taking the Senate have improved recently. Right. And so we will have to look back at this over the next few weeks and then in historical retrospect to see whether or not perhaps Trump and McConnell damaged their prospects, the Republicans' prospects in the Senate by rushing the nomination to replace Justice Ginsburg. And we now know that it's Amy Barrett who will be nominated to replace Ginsburg. I want to really focus now for the next few minutes on the Senate and the Senate's role in American politics. And one of the questions I want to ask is whether or not the design of the Constitution, which was in particular to use the Senate and the Electoral College to protect less populous states from domination by more populous states, is at this point being perverted to bring about what might be called minoritarian rule. That is to say, rule by a minority against the will of the majority. And so the first thing to notice is that the Senate is more conservative than the United States as a whole, based on objective opinion research on where the American people is. And whether we're talking about cultural issues like gay marriage or civil rights or Black Lives Matters, or we're talking about economic issues like how redistributive or progressive the tax scheme should be, or how active government should be in environmental policy, etc. When we look at where the American people is as a whole, and we look at where the Senate is clearly skewed to the right relative to most of America. Now, having said that, I think there's an additional problem or issue with the Senate right now. And that's why I've got Mitch McConnell's image on this slide as well. And that is to do with the way in which Mitch McConnell, the majority leader in the Senate, is using partisan power within the Senate. And to be clear, it seems to me that McConnell is using his power or his party's power in a kind of partisan domination way, because the party is further to the right than the American people, because the party's power in the Senate comes from a minority of the population, right? Roughly 20% of the American population elects 50 senators, right? And I'll get into this more. And because McConnell essentially believes that the party in power should use its power to extract maximal victory, right? And so block Obama's Supreme Court appointment and then put your own Supreme Court appointment in under exactly similar circumstances, right? This is a different kind of way of running the Senate from the way we've seen in the past. And so when we talk about minoritarian rule, it's not just that the Senate has a bias to it, it's also that the leadership in the Senate is exploiting that bias to maximal advantage without much consideration for the fact that they are in fact representative of a minority, or that they might have a duty of civility within a democracy to take seriously the ideas of the opposing power, the opposing party. That they don't seem to be behaving that way, and so to now focus a little bit more on the difficulty with the Senate, I want to look at political geography, and so. I'm going to start with the United States as a whole, and I'm going to use the four categories that demographers typically use: urban, suburban, exurban, and rural. And so when you think of urban, suburban, and exurban, I think you can think of concentric circles surrounding a urban area. The urban area itself has high population density. Most people live very close to each other. Many live in multi-residential units like you guys live in an apartment or a tower, etc. And they are in a metropolitan area that has 100,000 or more people in it, right? The suburban areas are further out from the urban core. They have less population density. They're typically single family homes. In order to shop or get to work, you have to drive. But nevertheless, the homes are relatively close together, typically within 100 feet of each other. When you get to the third ring, ex-urban areas, right? You're no longer in the relatively dense suburbs. You're in places that are still within 20 to 50 miles of an urban area. But because land is less valuable, because there's less density, people have more land, they're less close to each other. And finally, then we have rural areas. And these are areas where there really is no urban center, where people are much more typically involved in the agricultural economy as opposed to an industrial, information or financial based economy as you would get in the urban, suburban, and many of the ex-urban areas, right? And so what you can see is that when you break America down, it's roughly equal between these four categories. If you believe, as most demographers do, that the urban and ex-urban areas go together, then they're slightly more than half of the population. By the way, the ex-urban areas are kind of in a category to themselves. They don't just naturally align with the rural areas. But when we look at representation in the Senate, what we see is a real skew away from the urban areas and in the direction of the rural areas, right? So as you can see, it's almost as if you took half the urban pie and gave it to the rural areas. And that is because the less populous states get the same representation as the most populous states in the Senate. 2 senators per state, whether or not the state is like Wyoming and Montana, almost exclusively rural with very little population, or California and New York, lots of dense urban population, much larger. doesn't matter, equal representation. So what you can see then is a real skew. And then when we go back to the ideological slant of the Senate, part of what we are seeing is essentially that people who live in the rural areas in America are more conservative than people who live in the urban and suburban areas, and are disproportionately represented in the Senate. And this then has a real bearing on who ends up in the Supreme Court, right? Because according to our Constitution, it is the Senate that has the right to advise and consent the president exercise the power of advise and consent over the president's judicial nominees, right? And what this diagram shows, and it's a little tricky to follow, but the big transitions in the court's history. So, right, one of them occurred in the middle of the 1960s when Chief Justice Warren was replaced by Berger, right? And another occurred in the late 1980s when Justice Thurgood Marshall was replaced by Justice Thomas, right? And as you can see, it's a little tricky to predict exactly how conservative Amy Barrett will be, but assuming she doesn't have a radical change of identity, kind of Sal on the road to Damascus change when she gets onto the Supreme Court, she will be perhaps the third most important ideological swing in the modern history of the court. Here's another way of looking at this. There was an ideological change of +8 in a conservative direction when Thomas replaced Marshall, a +7 change when Berger replaced Warren, around perhaps a 5 to 6 degree change if Barrett replaces Ginsburg. And please note that almost all of the changes in the recent history of the court, going all the way back to the late 1960s, have been changes in the conservative direction. And this reflects the fact that the Senate is a more conservative institution, and that the Senate has a stranglehold on the federal judiciary. Maybe that's putting things too strongly, but they exercise an effective veto over who can be on the federal judiciary. And so one way to see this, and I want to point out that although we would be getting a big rightward shift on the court, and I want to say maybe one more thing about this before I move into the next slide, which is that not only would this be a big ideological shift on the court in terms of a single justice replacing another justice, this would also cement a conservative voting bloc on the court. And I think at the moment, the court is relatively conservative, but as we can see, right, Chief Justice Roberts, let's see, I'm sorry, is right here, right? And he's actually moved a little bit to the center of the ideological rank of the court. And right until Ginsburg's death, Roberts was the swing vote, right? So there was a possibility that the liberals would prevail. If Ginsburg is replaced by a very conservative justice like Amy Barrett, it will be very unlikely that there will be a liberal majority on the court for a very long time, right? We'll have to see what happens in the future with Justice Thomas, for instance. But having said that, the impact of appointing a conservative Supreme Court justice to replace a liberal Supreme Court justice depends not only on the individual, but the overall composition of the court. This is going to fundamentally alter the composition of the court in addition to the ideology of the particular justice. And we can see this by looking over time, right? Which is to say, what has the composition of the court been over the last 40 years? And we can see that at no point over the last 40 years has there ever been a majority on the court appointed by Democrats. Now, some of that has to do with the fact that between Nixon, Reagan, and the first Bush, the Republicans controlled the presidency for a very long time, with only Carter in the middle, right? And as you can see, Carter didn't get any appointments, right? You can see, right, Reagan got 3, Clinton got 3, Bush got 3, and I hope this is apparent the way this is working, right? This is by term, right? So Bush got 1 in his first term and 2 in his second term. Obama got 1 in his first term and 2 in his second term. As close as the court has been to a Democrat majority was in 2016 after Scalia's death, when there was a 4-4 split on the court. But then it's moved back to 5-3 right at the present. And if Trump succeeds in appointing another justice, it will be 6-3. And so please note that for most of the last 40 years, the Republican appointees have been in a solid majority on the court. And this then reflects the Senate's skew in terms of the balance on the Senate, as well as what happens with the Electoral College and the way in which that translates less populous states' power to elect a president. So that twice recently, we've had a Republican lose the popular vote, but win the Electoral College vote. Now, when we look at the federal judiciary more broadly, there is a transition or transformation occurring where for much of the last 40 years, it has been the case that there's been rough parity or periods in which, in fact, the majority of the federal judiciary, if we look at the top of the judiciary, the circuit courts, were appointed by Democrats, right? And so it goes back and forth, a seesaw. But it does appear, again, that Republicans are consolidating control, and in fact, that they've had control over many periods. And so the idea that somehow the judiciary is biased, the judiciary is skewed, which is typically presented by conservatives as a critique of judicial activism, is actually not accurate to the composition of the judiciary. Now, I want to stop here with the slideshow and speak with you for a moment about what I take to be the deeper underlying issue. And my concern is that given what's happening with the ideology, the demography, and the conduct of the parties, especially the Republican Party, in the United States right now, we are potentially in for a long haul in which, even if the Democrats win both the presidency and the Senate in this election, they may be incapable of passing, or I shouldn't say passing legislation, of having the legislation they pass be enforced if the Supreme Court remains very conservative and uses that power to strike down Democratic passed legislation. And so my worry is that in this case, as in many cases, we are being hampered by our Constitution, and things that may have made sense either in principle or as compromises in the 1780s and 1790s are not working in the 2020s, right? And so my question is, what, if anything, can be done about this? And I'm going to talk with you very briefly about a couple different proposals. One of them is so-called court packing. And that would be to say, so if the Democrats do win, and by the way, if the Democrats don't win the presidency and the Senate, there's really nothing that can be done about this, right? And in a sense, perhaps nothing should be done about it in that scenario. But in the scenario in which they win both the Senate and the presidency and retain control of the House, they seem to have a few different options. One of them would be to pack the courts. And by that, I mean increase the membership in the Supreme Court so that Joe Biden can appoint 2 or 3 or 4 more members of the court and bring about either a change in the balance of power or at least a rough equilibrium on the court. I have to say, I think of that as a short-term and somewhat desperate strategy. And it's one that I think has the disadvantage of being the kind of naked power play that we associate with Mitch McConnell, and that erodes support for democratic norms. We shouldn't alter the composition of an institution in order to just change the balance of power. That I think is an important principle and one we should try to live by. I'm about to say something that you may think is a bit too refined, but one more thought before we get there. Should we have term limits or age limits on the Senate? And here I have to, I'm sorry, I said on the Senate, on the Supreme Court, sorry. And here I have to say, I do think that that's a better idea. And if we look at this over time, what we can see is several different trends. On the one hand, Supreme Court justices are being appointed at younger ages. And on the other hand, they're living longer, as are all of us. And they tend to be serving longer, not retiring, but dying on the court. And so if we look at the average length of tenure of a Supreme Court justice in the 19th century and compare it with the present, it's about 50% longer today. It's gone up to 30 years from about 20 years in the 19th century. And so I think there's a good argument to be made for the idea that we want to have a regular turnover on the Supreme Court. Sotomayor, in a famous recent dissent, worried that about being ruled by rulers in robes, is the way she put it, right? That those 9 people should not have the power to rule the rest of us in ways that fundamentally depart from our deepest convictions or the direction of public opinion in our country. And one way to assure that the Supreme Court does not get far out of line with public opinion in the country is to keep new justices coming into the court. So some sort of term limit or age limit on the justices seems to me to be a better proposal for reform. But at the same time, I will point out to you, it doesn't really address the fundamental problem. And the fundamental problem is the one that I just spent a long time talking with you about: the nature of representation on the Senate, the skew in the direction of rural, more conservative areas. And again, this is out of whack with what it was at the founding or the first 100 years of American constitutional government. At the founding, the difference in size between the largest and the smallest state was about 20 to 1. Right now, it's about 70 to 1. And so the idea that a state that is 70 times larger than another state should have equal power over federal judicial appointments when that has become so important to our political life, or that the smaller states' power should be amplified in the Electoral College, may be more anti-majoritarian or minoritarian in the present moment than it was at the founding or the first 100 years of the Republic. Now, having said that, I think it's a non-starter to think that we can change the principle of representation in the Senate or in the Electoral College. It is entrenched in our Constitution in a way that makes it really impossible to overcome. Every state would have to agree. It's the one issue on which we require unanimous as opposed to 2/3 agreement in order for it to be passed. So what's the other possibility? And here I will conclude by saying what I think I favor. And I'm still thinking this through, but I think we need to be thinking about expanding the states. And it seems to me the most obvious and the most democratic, small d, approach would be to offer statehood to Washington, D.C. and to Puerto Rico. And DC, it seems quite obvious, right? DC is in fact larger than several states, right? And so the idea that they do not have representation in the Senate, and as a result that their votes in presidential races do not count for as much as people who live in states, just doesn't seem to make sense, right? So make DC a state. With Puerto Rico, we would have to offer them statehood. But again, we have a whole large island filled with people who are citizens who nevertheless are often neglected in American politics, in part because their votes do not have the same impact as other American votes. So that would not totally solve this problem, but it would begin to address the problem of disproportionate representation in the Senate and what it does to the judiciary. I'll stop there and take some questions, thoughts, comments. I would imagine you have some. I am now going to unmute everyone, so beware that your background noise will show up. You may also have to unmute yourself. I see I've got one comment. And John Campbell says to me, the rural small state bias is built into the Constitution, which would never would have been passed without. Absolutely agree with you, John. So having said that, that doesn't mean we can't try to, if it becomes too imbalanced, fix it. And you know, there are other proposals, for instance, that larger states get a third senator, right? And we'd have to talk more about that. But how do we get the leverage to actually bring that about? That's difficult to envision because that requires constitutional amendment. The good thing about adding new states is that it can be done without constitutional amendment. It can be done through simple legislation. All right, who wants to start us out with a comment or a question?
I'm so depressed.
That's a comment, I guess, Flossie.
I try with all my might to eat as much ice cream as I can. That takes me back to the days of the Philip Rush man and the ice cream cart. I have to hope, I know that, and I have to hope and believe that the Americans can spite a rat when they see one. They gave us Obama for one, yes. I'm hoping that that same spirit that brought in Obama will bring in Biden. That's my hope.
And clearly Biden is not Obama, right? Obama is a once in a generation charismatic politician, a constitutional lawyer, a transformational figure, right? The first African-American president. Biden is not charismatic. Biden is not a transformational figure. Biden, by his own account, is a transitional leader, right? And in a sense,
Biden is a blinzer.
I don't know the reference. Can you explain,
A
Plessy?
flat pancake. You can put sour cream on it.
Okay.
All right.
Having said all of that, Biden is the anti-Trump, right? And that seems to be the basis for his campaign. I am not Trump, right? And that may be sufficient to get him elected. And by the way, it may be that the Republicans through and let us remember, right, that this party that is about to vote apparently to appoint a Supreme Court justice to fundamentally alter the balance of the court against their avowed principle of just 4 years ago is also the party that voted to acquit Donald Trump when he was impeached for having worked with a foreign power to undermine his domestic rival. It's the same party that when Donald Trump says, I don't know about a peaceful transition, says, well, we're all in favor of a peaceful transition, but refuses to criticize Trump, right? It's the same party that has essentially fallen in line with Donald Trump despite his continued violation of core norms of democracy, small d. And so having said all of that, if we do get Joe Biden as president, if we do get the Democratic control of the Senate, I do think on the one hand, there is something reassuring about that, right? And so we might be a little bit more than a month away from feeling a lot better about American democracy. But having said that, if in the meantime, the Republicans have appointed another member to the Supreme Court, I hope, but bear with me, Flossie, that the Democrats will understand that their opponent is now playing a different game, right? They're playing a game of trying to convert the minority power into domination, right? Into unalterable holds on power. We add to that voter suppression, gerrymandering, right? The perversion of the Department of Justice, right? And I think we get to a place where the Democrats may see we can't just be happy that we won. We've got to do something to alter the structure of power as long as the party that we're competing with will so boldly abuse power whenever they have it. And that's the reason I'm talking with you today about the possibility of adding new states, right? It's a strange thing to be discussing, but it's one of the ways in which to check the Republican Party at the moment. And John sent me an article, some of you may have seen it, it was published in the New York Review of Books by a political scientist at Bard University arguing that for the sake of American democracy, we need to hope that the Democratic Party dominates American politics for something like the next decade, until the Republican Party recasts itself as a modern conservative party, reconciles itself to the changing demographics of our society, and figures out a way to win with a diverse constituency as opposed to being a party that's almost exclusively supported by white rural conservatives, right?
I did send a check to the DCCC today.
All right. Well,
Yes.
good. Matt, are you trying to come in? I see your box lighting up.
Yes, it's lighting up.
Well, I just, I'm greatly distressed by what's going on, but if there's one small, ray of hope out there, over the years, a lot of justices who have come into the Supreme Court very conservative have gotten some of those rough edges sanded off. I mean, Hugo Black, very Southern gentleman, wound up as a very liberal justice on the court. Earl Warren was pretty far to the right, and by the time he was through, he was rated as a liberal. So maybe some of these justices will, see the light, and that may be some small ray of hope.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. And I guess my job today is maybe to douse cold water on rays of hope. And so let me just show you a little bit what I'm reading right now, and what I will be at some point in the not too distant future probably talking with you about. So this is Michael Tomasky's new book. Some of you may know him. He writes in the New York Times and the New York Review of Books. If we can keep it, right? How the Republic collapsed and how it might be saved. You may remember the story. It appears to be accurate that Ben Franklin, leaving the Constitutional Convention on the final day, was asked by a woman, "Did you give us a monarchy or a republic?" And Franklin replied, "A republic if you can keep it." Right, and so what Tomasky argues in this book, among other things, is that we have a different kind of partisan polarization in America than we've ever had before. And that's because our parties have become ideologically pure. And so the old Democratic Party contained both Northern liberals and Southern segregationists, right? And so there was a real intra-party competition. And that competition also existed within the Republican Party, right? There were liberal or moderate Republicans, right? And that what's changed in the first instance is that the parties have become much more ideologically pure. And the second thing that has changed is that they've become much more interested in ideologically vetting their judges, right? And so we combine an ideologically pure party with a desire to make sure that the justice that you appoint is themselves going to toe that line, that partisan line, then the partisan identity of the judge matters much more. And so one of the things we're seeing in the last 20 years in the Supreme Court is that the party of the president who appointed the justice predicts the justice's voting behavior much more than it did 40, 50 years ago. You're absolutely right about Black and Warren, especially Warren, right? And by all accounts, Eisenhower was quite disappointed with Warren's behavior on the court. But having said that, he was not chosen to be a pure conservative justice, whereas Amy Barrett is being chosen precisely for that reason, right? Bob asked me in the chat bar, and I've got a couple other comments in the chat bar, so I'll go over them. Did 538's state-by-state prediction get better between 2020 and 2016? And I'll say two things to you, Bob. One is 538 wasn't so bad in 2016. There was an article that they published in late October that said there's a growing likelihood that Donald Trump will lose the popular vote but win the electoral college vote. They estimated that likelihood at about 20%. And I will just remind you that a whole bunch of improbable things had to happen for Trump to win, including James Comey announcing a new investigation into Hillary Clinton 10 days before the election, including Wikipedia, almost certainly with the Russians' assistance, dumping a trove of damaging emails right before the election, right? And even with that, 100,000, 200,000 votes go differently in a few Midwestern states, and Hillary Clinton is the president, right? So having said all of that, they weren't as far off, and some of what happened in 2016, in a sense, you shouldn't just blame the pollsters. There were unanticipated events that occurred. Having said all that, yes, they have tried to get better, right? They've tried in particular to figure out if there are so-called hidden Trump voters, and if so, how they can correct for that, or if there are rural voters who don't respond to pollsters' calls, how they can correct for that. So they are trying. Let's see, from Ruth, I've got today's Times that Obama tried to get Ginsburg to retire when she was 80. And I just took a quick glance at that, Ruth, and what I saw was that he gently broached the topic. And what Ginsburg, in my understanding, said back, and I believe said publicly as well, is that there may be another decent president after Obama, right? It turns out she was not entirely right about that, at least probably given what she meant by decent. And so what do I think about it? Well, I'm not quite sure what to say. One of the things I would say is that Ginsburg, probably like everybody else, was a bit surprised, and she might have preferred that Hillary Clinton appoint her successor, given the fact that she was appointed by Bill Clinton, given the fact that she would then have been probably the first person whose successor was appointed by a woman. Who knows how it would have played out, but right, that might have made some sense to her. And the other thing I would point out is that Ginsburg, as many people have said, did not get where she got by backing down or surrendering or giving up early, right? And so Ginsburg remained an active force on the court for the last 3.5 years, right? And so maybe she just wasn't ready. So no, I don't blame Ginsburg, if that's the gist of your question, for not having gotten out of the way when it was still possible for Obama to replace her successor. I think the problem is squarely in the court of the Republicans and their naked hypocrisy and use of power. And that's unfortunately why the Democrats need to be more realpolitik in thinking about what they're going to do. But having said that, I think it's essential that the Democrats not just become the mirror image of Mitch McConnell's Republicans. If they do that, then they are, in a sense, giving up on the most important principles in order to win the current battle, right? As opposed to winning the battle by losing the war, the Democrats need to do things that are compatible with democracy. And it seems to me that fully enfranchising the American citizens who live in Washington, D.C. is one thing that has that double advantage. It does, in fact, help to alter the skew in the Senate at the same time that it is compatible with core democratic principles. That's why I come down in favor of that kind of proposal. I thought I heard one other person starting to talk. I'm happy to take one more question or comment today.
David, I have one.
Go ahead, John.
I often ask questions about tactics that you're not so interested in, but I'm really curious about what a logical strategy in the upcoming hearings for the Supreme Court should be. And it's going to be so tempting to unload on this person and to bring out all, Roe v. Wade, or bring out every left issue the Democrats have in mind to get it out and exposed. But to my mind, that would be a disaster. I think if they handle it right, I think they can make the case about why this is really a lousy thing without impugning her personally. That has really backfired for Democrats by and large. I mean, you could say it backfired with Bork over the long time, but it's people don't like it.
Yeah, and so I'm inclined to agree with you. How do you call into question the legitimacy of the appointment altogether without viciously attacking the person who's the appointee, right? And
That's
so one of the strategies the Democrats are discussing is boycotting the hearings altogether, right?
That's, I think that's stupid.
Well, it certainly it involves surrendering your soapbox, right? I do think, and you're right that I don't tend to be as interested in the minutia of the strategy, but I do think that one of the things that we need to be thinking about here is, in a sense, two different questions. One of them is there anything the Democrats can do to prevent Trump and the Republicans from seating a new member to the Supreme Court between now and January, assuming that the Trump doesn't win re-election, right? And you know that there are some procedural things that the Democrats can do to slow this down. I'm not sure there's anything they can do to stop it. I think the other question is, what can they do to make the Republicans bear the cost at the ballot box for their hypocrisy? And that's really a question about control of the Senate, not a question about control of the Supreme Court. And so, in a sense, maybe what the Democratic strategy should be is really to put their Republican colleagues under a bright spotlight for their hypocrisy, for their naked power grab, for their effort to use the court to block future Democratic legislation, as opposed to focusing on this particular justice. But how that works in a hearing, I'm not entirely sure.
I don't think power grab gets you any place with anybody except Democrats who are already committed.
Agreed.
Yeah, that would be sad if true, but that doesn't mean that it isn't true. All right, everybody. I obviously didn't do one iota on the topic of today's lecture, but I think what's happening in our politics is sufficiently important that it makes sense for us to be talking about it today.
Thank
I
you.
will do my best to steer us back to issues of race and justice next week, with the proviso that another week in our crazy politics will have transpired by then, and who knows what else will have come into our sights. Take care, everybody. Be careful out there with the bad air, but hope you will be well, and look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye. Take care.
Okay, thank you, David.
Bye.
Bye.